The sky over the rural equine therapy center darkened as a sudden storm rolled in, casting a somber shadow over the paddocks. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, and distant thunder echoed across the fields. In a secluded enclosure, a retired cavalry horse named Valor stood motionless, his coat a dappled gray marred by the scars of past battles. His ears flicked back at the sound of approaching footsteps, and his dark eyes, usually calm, now mirrored a storm of their own. Luke Harrington, a former soldier in his early 30s, limped slightly as he approached the paddock. His once athletic frame was leaner now, his face etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and memories that refused to fade. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his cheekbone, a permanent reminder of the explosion that had ended his military career. His eyes, a piercing blue, searched the paddock until they settled on Valor. The horse's gaze met his for a fleeting moment before turning away, a silent dismissal that cut deeper than any blade. The therapy center, nestled amidst rolling hills and sprawling pastures, was a haven for veterans and retired service animals alike. Its mission was to heal the invisible wounds of war through the bond between man and beast. Luke had been sent here as a last resort, his commanding officer insisting that traditional therapy had failed him. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very creature that had once been his partner in combat was now his prescribed path to healing. Emily, the center's lead therapist, observed the interaction from a distance. In her late 20s, she possessed a wisdom beyond her years, her demeanor both gentle and unyielding. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a practical braid, and her green eyes missed nothing. She approached Luke with a measured stride, her boots barely making a sound on the damp earth. "He's not the same horse you knew," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Luke's jaw tightened. "Neither am I." A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that sent Valor into a brief frenzy. He reared up, nostrils flaring, before retreating to the far corner of the paddock. Luke's fists clenched at his sides, the memory of another storm, another battlefield, surfacing unbidden. The mission had been routine, or so they had thought. Patrolling a village on the outskirts of conflict, Luke and Valor had been inseparable. The bond between soldier and steed was forged in the crucible of war, each relying on the other for survival. But that day, something had gone terribly wrong. An ambush, a deafening explosion, and then chaos. Valor had spooked, throwing Luke to the ground before disappearing into the smoke. When Luke awoke, his legs shattered and his unit decimated, Valor was nowhere to be found. The betrayal had festered within him, a wound that refused to heal. And now, standing before the very creature that had abandoned him, the pain was as raw as ever. Emily studied Luke's rigid posture, sensing the turmoil beneath the surface. "Healing isn't linear," she said gently. "Neither for you nor for him." Luke's eyes remained fixed on Valor. "I don't know if I can do this." "Give it time," Emily urged. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight." The rain began to fall in earnest, each drop a cool sting against Luke's skin. He turned away from the paddock, retreating to the modest cabin that would be his home for the next month. The interior was sparse but comfortable, the scent of pine lingering in the air. He sank onto the bed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. Sleep came fitfully, dreams plagued by echoes of the past. Morning arrived with a tentative sun peeking through the dissipating clouds. Luke found himself drawn back to the paddock, a reluctant moth to a familiar flame. Valor stood grazing, the picture of equine serenity. But as Luke approached, the horse's muscles tensed, and he took a deliberate step away. Frustration bubbled beneath Luke's calm facade. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, endured hardships that would break lesser men. Yet here he was, unable to bridge the chasm between himself and the horse. Charlie, a fellow veteran and longtime resident of the center, leaned against the fence, observing the scene with a knowing eye. In his late 40s, Charlie had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much and survived to tell the tale. "He's testing you," Charlie remarked, his voice a gravelly baritone. Luke shot him a sideways glance. "Feels more like he's punishing me." Charlie shrugged. "Maybe he is. Or maybe he's just scared." The word struck a chord, Fear. It was an emotion Luke was all too familiar with. Perhaps Valor wasn't the only one grappling with it. Days passed in a monotonous rhythm. Luke spent hours by the paddock, sometimes speaking in hushed tones, other times simply sitting in silence. Valor remained distant, though the initial hostility seemed to wane, replaced by a wary. Absolutely, here is section 2 of Retired Horse Rejects its former combatant. But what happens next moves everyone. Crafted to be 1,500 words with vivid detail, emotional depth, and a cinematic pace. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light across the paddock. A chill hung in the air, not from the weather, but from the silence that clung between man and horse. Caleb stood at the fence again, hands resting on the top rail, watching Samson graze in the distance. There had been no change. Days had passed since the stallion's cold rejection, and yet Caleb returned, not with expectations, but with a quiet yearning, an apology that had no words, only presence. He hadn't tried to touch the horse again, not once. He simply showed up each morning with a thermos of coffee, sometimes a newspaper folded under his arm, sometimes nothing at all. He sat on an upturned bucket, patient and still. Samson always kept his distance, ears flicking but body turned slightly away, a sentinel of suspicion. But today something shifted. The wind rustled the leaves just so, and Caleb's quiet humming, an old tune he didn't even realize he was doing, carried across the paddock. Samson's head lifted, his ears pricked forward. The stallion turned, slowly, cautiously. Caleb kept his eyes on the grass, not daring to meet Samson's gaze. The horse took a single step, then another. Caleb could feel it before he saw it, the way the air changed when trust entered the space. He glanced up just once. Samson stood 5 feet away. "I didn't know how to be kind back then," Caleb said, barely a whisper. "I only knew orders, and how to survive." Samson blinked slowly. "I shouldn't have pushed you like I did. I didn't deserve your loyalty." He didn't expect forgiveness, but something passed between them, neither spoken nor seen. And then, as suddenly as he'd approached, Samson turned and walked away. Not in fear, not in anger. It felt like consideration. That evening, Caleb returned to the main house where Mags was seated on the porch swing, knitting. She looked up as he approached, sensing something different in his gait. "He looked at me today," Caleb said. Mags smiled softly. "He remembers." They sat for a while in silence, watching the sun melt into the horizon. "You know," she finally said, "you were a different man back then." "I was a soldier." "You were scared," she corrected, "and trained to hide it." He nodded, throat tight. Mags looked down at her knitting, fingers never stopping. "He came back for more same as you, just without the words to say so." The next day, Caleb tried something different. He entered the paddock with a halter, not to put it on, but to leave it. He set it on the ground, halfway between his usual sitting spot and where Samson lingered near the trees. Then he backed away. Samson approached cautiously. He sniffed the leather, nudged it with his nose, then retreated again. A dance of memories. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak. Later that week, Caleb found himself beside Mags in the barn, brushing down one of the newer rescues. "You know," she said, without looking up. Samson wasn't always like this. Before the war, he was gentle, loved people. "What happened over there?" Caleb asked. Mags paused. Her face tightened. "After your unit left, they sent him out again. Different handler. Not kind. Pushed him hard. Broke him down. He came back hollow." Caleb's chest burned. Guilt weighed heavy. "I wish I'd known," he muttered. "You couldn't have stopped it, but you can help now." That night, Caleb stayed late in the barn. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Some sign, maybe. The moonlight poured in through the slats, turning the hay silver. In the corner stall, Samson stirred. And then, slowly, the stallion came to the gate, watching him. No anger. No fear. Caleb took a step closer. Samson didn't move. They stood there in silence, man and horse, past and present colliding in stillness. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, faded photograph. It was from deployment. Him in uniform, younger, harder, holding Samson's reins like a trophy. But what stood out wasn't pride. It was the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his grip. He held the horse, but not gently. Samson's ears were pinned back. "I thought I had to control you to survive," he whispered. "But I see now. You were the only thing that kept me human." The next morning, Caleb didn't bring the halter. He brought apples. This time, Samson approached first. He sniffed the offering, took a hesitant bite, then stood still as Caleb reached up and gently ran a hand along his neck. No tension, no resistance. For the first time since reuniting, they shared touch without trauma. The weeks that followed were filled with small victories. A lead rope clipped on without panic. A gentle walk along the fence line. A moment of rest with Samson's head lowered beside Caleb's shoulder. Mags watched from afar, never interfering, but always aware. One afternoon, a young girl named Lucy arrived at the sanctuary. She was no more than 12, thin and pale, with eyes too old for her age. Her foster mother explained she'd been through several homes. Withdrawn. Didn't talk much. Mags, always intuitive, gave her a brush and pointed toward Samson's stall. "He won't hurt you," she said, "and he knows what it's like not to trust right away." Lucy was hesitant, but something about the stallion drew her in. She approached quietly, brush in hand, and stood at the stall gate. Samson didn't move. She opened the gate. He remained still. With small, careful movements, Lucy began to brush him. Her strokes were uneven, but not from fear, from reverence. She whispered something Caleb couldn't hear. But whatever it was, Samson listened. That night, Caleb watched them from a distance. He felt something stir inside. Hope, maybe. Or grace. "Think he knows she's like him?" he asked Mags. Mags, arms folded, nodded. Horses know pain when they see it, and they don't judge the way people do. Caleb thought of all the times he'd been dismissed for looking like nothing, for sounding like a shell of the man he used to be. But Samson had seen through it. Eventually, maybe Lucy would too. Later, as the days passed, Lucy's smile returned, bit by bit, and Samson, once stoic and guarded, began to nuzzle her pockets for treats. They healed quietly in tandem, but progress, as always, brought its tests. One evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the hills. Lightning cracked across the sky. Horses in the barn grew restless. Caleb and Mags scrambled to calm them, checking stalls, securing gates. Then they realized Samson was missing. The gate had been blown open. Caleb grabbed a flashlight and ran out into the storm, calling his name. "Samson!" Rain poured in sheets. The wind tore through the trees like a scream. "Samson!" He caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow racing across the pasture. Then he saw him, Samson, wild-eyed, galloping toward the far tree-line. Without hesitation, Caleb ran. He chased through mud and wind, heart pounding, lungs burning. "Stop, Samson!" The stallion paused at the edge of the trees, turning just long enough for Caleb to see the recognition in his eyes. Caleb stopped short, arms outstretched. "Please," he gasped. "Not again." They stood like that for a long beat, two survivors, drenched in rain and memory. And then, slowly, Samson stepped forward. Caleb dropped to his knees in the mud, overwhelmed. The horse came to him, and for the first time, laid his head against the man's shoulder. Not in duty, not in fear, in forgiveness. When they returned to the barn, soaked but whole, Lucy was waiting with a dry towel and a look that said everything she didn't have to. "You came back," she whispered. Samson nickered softly. Caleb turned to her. "So did you." As the storm faded and dawn broke, the sanctuary felt different. Warmer, lighter. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer defined them. And for the first time, Caleb believed the last part of the journey was finally within reach. The crowd had gone silent, not out of boredom, but out of breathless anticipation. No one moved, not even the birds that had fluttered between the rafters earlier. All eyes were on the paddock, where the old warhorse stood still as stone. Jonah remained outside the fence, arms crossed over the worn denim of his jacket, his face unreadable. His former partner, the horse he'd trained, ridden, and trusted through the brutal noise of war, stood on the other side, staring at him with the blank eyes of a stranger. The second rejection still lingered in the air. A twitch of the tail. A pivot of hooves. That's all it took to sever a memory from the present. A younger trainer leaned toward the manager, whispering something. The manager gave a slow shake of the head. "No one else gets close to that horse," he muttered. "He's barely eating. Skittish. Could have hurt someone yesterday." Jonah didn't argue. He didn't have to. He knew what this looked like. A washed-up soldier. A ruined horse. Both relics from a story the world was too eager to forget. But he wasn't here to beg the horse to remember him. He was here to remember the horse, and maybe remind him of who he used to be. He stepped back, not out of fear, but respect. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the thing he'd carried all this way. A tattered, sweat-stained neck rope. Faded brass clasp. A slight bend in the leather where teeth had once chewed on it out of boredom during long reconnaissance nights. He held it out, not toward the horse, but toward the wind, and turned his back to the paddock. He walked away. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The silence was louder now. 3 steps. 4. Then a sound quiet but undeniable. Hooves. Turning slowly, Jonah looked back. The horse had taken a step. It was a small thing, maybe meaningless to someone else. But Jonah knew better. War horses didn't move without intent. Even in retirement, that instinct remained buried beneath years of rust and dust. And this movement, it wasn't reflex. It was recognition. Still, Jonah didn't push. He crouched, resting on his heels, letting the rope dangle in the dirt. The air felt electric. Every breeze, every creak of wood, every heartbeat, suspended. The horse, whom they'd once called Valor, lowered his head slightly. His ears flicked. He stepped again. This time closer. It wasn't a reunion. Not yet. It was a test. One of many. That night, Jonah stayed in the barn. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he couldn't bring himself to leave. He sat on a pile of hay, near Valor's stall, not speaking, not reaching, just being there. For hours, the horse kept his back turned. But sometime after midnight, when the moon filtered through the slats and the wind whispered through the trees, the stall door creaked softly. The old gelding took one step forward and exhaled a heavy, tired breath. Jonah didn't move. He didn't need to. In the morning, Valor stood closer to the door. Not quite friendly, but no longer lost. Each day after, the bond stretched and bent, tested by time and memory. Jonah brought carrots, not the shiny store-bought kind, but dusty ones still clinging to dirt. He spoke rarely, only when the air felt right. Sometimes about war, sometimes about weather, but mostly about forgiveness. By the end of the week, Valor let him touch his muzzle again, only for a second, only gently. The next week, Jonah saddled him, not to ride, but to remind him. And one evening, when the sun painted fire across the sky, Jonah mounted. The barn staff rushed forward, voices rising in panic. "You can't. He hasn't let anyone ride in years. He'll bolt, he might buck." Jonah didn't answer. He didn't have to. He clicked his tongue, whispered the old command, and Valor moved. Not fast, not smooth, but forward. A collective hush fell again. The same people who had rolled their eyes when the man walked in weeks ago, coat tattered and boots dusty, now leaned on the rails with awe etched into their faces. Each ride grew stronger. The rhythm returned. The trust, brick by brick, rebuilt itself. Not perfectly, not like it was before, but better in its own broken way. Then came the letter. It wasn't from the military, nor from any rescue organization. It came from a boy, 10 years old, his handwriting crooked, his heart clear. "Dear Mr. Jonah, I saw the video of you and Valor. My dad said you used to be soldiers together. I think that's cool. I'm scared of everything. Thunder, school, even horses. But when I saw Valor wasn't scared anymore, it made me think I could be brave too. Can I meet him one day? Love, Aiden." Jonah folded the letter slowly. He read it again. And again. Something in him, long dormant, unlocked. A week later, the ranch hosted an open day. Veterans, children, parents, trainers, all gathered. Not to watch a show, but to witness something rare. At the center stood Valor. Not dressed in medals. Not adorned with ribbons. Just standing. Strong. Jonah lifted Aiden into the saddle himself. The boy trembled. Jonah whispered gently, "He's with you. Same way he was with me." Valor didn't flinch. 1 step. 2. Then 3. The boy's fear melted into something radiant. Confidence. Peace. Tears welled in the eyes of strangers. Trainers. Soldiers. Even the ranch manager, who once refused Jonah entry. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Afterward, Jonah sat beside the boy, watching the sun lower itself into the hills. "He didn't trust me at first," he said. "Sometimes when you've been hurt, it takes time." Aiden nodded, stroking the horse's mane. "But you waited." "Yeah," Jonah replied, "because he was worth it." Valor blinked slowly, then nuzzled Jonah's shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something deeper. A remembering. Later that night, as the barn grew quiet and the crowd faded into memory, Jonah stood beside the stall one last time. "You did good," he murmured. Valor didn't respond. He didn't have to. In the moonlight, Jonah turned, coat billowing behind him as he walked down the familiar dirt path. He didn't look back. Not because he was done, but because he finally understood. Sometimes the healing isn't loud. Sometimes the most moving moments are quiet. And sometimes a rejection is just the beginning of something deeper.